I couldn't soak up the information fast enough. I was fascinated to learn that the tides are changing. Someone who is looking at the scope of the next 30 to 50 years and thinking about all of the different pieces involved in end of life. It's innovations that approach the span of end of life, meaning everything from aging and active dying through postmortem care.
Tell us a little bit about that and how you see that connection as well. Welcome to the Digital Legacy Podcast, where we talk about death and dying in the digital age. If you ever asked, how do I protect myself and those I love if something unexpected happened to me? You're in the right place. I'm your host, Niki Weiss, and together we'll explore how to protect yourself in a world where both your physical and digital legacy leave a lasting impact. And welcome back to another episode of Death and Dying in the Digital Age. I'm Niki Weiss, your host, and I'm here with Sarah Parker Ward. Sarah, you and I met on LinkedIn, a few months ago when I was doing my research and looking into this whole, what I thought was an original death tech concept. But then I started noodling around and lo and behold, I found your profile, End of Life Futurist. Who would have thought? Tell us more, please.
Yeah, well, Niki, thank you so much for having me on. It's great to connect with you once again and to not only continue our conversations around what the future of end of life looks like, but to invite other people in to hear more and hopefully be inspired to dig deeper into this field. When I think about an end of life futurist, it's really someone who is looking at the scope of the next 30 to 50 years and thinking about all of the different pieces involved in end of life. Including technology, but certainly looking at things like the social aspects, the cultural aspects, the regulatory and bioethics components involved in what is a very tumultuous and also rapidly evolving landscape. So it's thinking at a sort of the seed in the ground and imagining the tree even after I'm gone. It's kind of that type of approach, really looking both from a macro perspective, what death is going to look like for people in this country 30 to 50 years down the line, even though it's so hard to predict tomorrow.
Especially with the climate change that we're dealing with. But talk to me about, you said rapidly. So what are those variables that are perpetuating the rapid change in end of life options for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, there's so much that's happening, and some of it has taken hold over a longer time course, right? When we think about some of the cultural changes, Tony Walter back in the mid 90s produced a book called The Revival of Death, and he was really starting to map out that there was this whole cultural revolution happening in the West where people wanted to essentially go back. They were romanticizing the way that we approached end of life in the mid 1800s and before that, where we really cared for our own dead. Our funerals took place in the home. They weren't commercialized or industrialized, and really going back to that. And so we've seen that continue to rise since the 90s, essentially what he was starting to see as a trend. And so on one hand, we have this sort of back to basics approach that's taking hold, people wanting to have more autonomy in the process, certainly wanting it to be far more personalized and focus perhaps what some would argue more on life than on the actual death component. And then at the same time, we have a real influx of death technologies, right? And I argue that a lot of that is a downstream effect of the silver tsunami. We have baby boomers turning 65 by a figure of 11,000 a day right now. And so there are certainly a lot of entrepreneurs, investors, private equity firms who see a huge market potential there. So applying new technologies to the end of life space, to the age space is certainly something that many are finding attractive.
And yet, at the norm, technology was never associated with the aspect of our lives, right? As far as our options post-mortem, especially with our digital legacies. So I know you and I, we've spoken about, it's not just how the quality of life at end of life, but what do we do with those digital assets that we've created throughout our lives? So would you say that that's also, if you and I are going to define, for those of our audience that don't know what death tech is, Do you have a definition we can go ahead and start expanding out on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's innovations that approach the span of end of life, meaning everything from aging and active dying through postmortem care, and certainly to overlook the digital footprints that we're all leaving behind would be absolutely silly. We have to incorporate that into the lexicon that we're using when we're talking about death tech. You and I have talked a lot about how is that digital footprint protected or not when we're postmortem, right? So for me personally, I've had the conversations with the folks who will be responsible for essentially me after I die, and have said very clearly, these are the things that I want wiped clean. Make sure that that data is taken from those organizations, that those accounts are fully closed. But also, don't use my data in ways that I don't agree with. So personally, I don't want there to be a ghost bot or a grief bot created out of my communication history. For other people, that's something that they are interested in, or that they simply are sort of neutral in response to. And for me, it's not necessarily about leading people in one direction or other, but again, making sure that they have autonomy and the education to make choices that truly are in line with their values.
Now, we've just thrown a few extra words out there that people might not be aware of. And
Sure.
when we started this conversation, you and I, every time we've gotten on a call together, the time flies because the topics just keep coming in. So what got you interested? Let's start back to the basics.
Yes.
You are Professor Sarah Parker Ward with Rensselaer. So I want if you could just share with our audience a little bit of your credentials and your journey into this space that no one really knows about.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. It's as you mentioned, Niki. There's
Passionate.
so much to cover. There is so much to cover. But yes, my journey with death started when I was a freshman in high school. My grandfather died, and I was very, very fortunate to be part of his vigil. We were in his home, supported by hospice. It was a beautiful experience. He passed late at night. A lot of community was there. We were able to be with his body afterwards. And it was just, it's not to say it wasn't sad or that, he didn't experience end of life agitation, as is very common, but the overall journey and the arc was one that just felt very deeply valuable in terms of ritual and in terms of knowledge beyond what perhaps scientific literature can capture. It wasn't until many years later that I learned to appreciate that as such and for the privilege that it was. And so after about 10 years in a career in digital advertising, I had had two children, both of whom were born at home. And I was really interested in health communication, and in particular, how people were deciding what they wanted, birth to look like for them. And so at that point, I decided to go back into academia, initially to study health communication around what most conceive of as the beginning of life. And while I was there, I discovered terror management theory as a result of exploring the fact that the same arc of industrialization and medicalization that had happened to birth in this country had actually happened to death, but just about 50 years earlier. And so I was just floored. I loved, as a realist, I loved this notion that, you know, even though death is a certainty, right? 100% of us are going to die with 100% certainty. So few people are talking about it. It's very much the norm, and really arguably a cultural taboo at this point, to engage in dialogue around end of life. And so once I had some theoretical background to really sink my teeth into, it was just off to the races for me. I couldn't soak up the information fast enough. And I was fascinated to learn that the tides are changing, and to see that both from a social perspective, but also driven by entrepreneurship and some of the new technologies that are available to us now. And so I finished up my PhD at Boston University, and took a short break as I welcomed my third child. And then now I've been at RPI in upstate New York for about 3 years.
I always said you and I were caught from the same cloth, and I don't think it's unusual that many birth doulas also become death doulas. Many of them have shared that same experience. I know for me and myself, even knowing I was very comfortable in the death and dying industry, it was right after my children were born, I went and I became like a maternity exercise instructor and a childbirth educator, and then went for my birth doula certification. And then I couldn't even tell you that at what point I pivoted. All of a sudden, it was an image. Like, it's the same light, right? It's the same journey going through the canal towards the light. I don't think a lot of people really understand that, but from a doula standpoint, and for those that don't know the word doula, maybe from an academic standpoint, you can share with us the terminology and the ideology of the term, and how doula got transformed from birth doula to now this emerging profession, end-of-life doulas or death doulas. Tell us a little bit about that and how you see that connection as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why, earlier when I shared, what some people consider to be the other end of life, between birth and death, that's not true of all belief systems, right? For instance, those that are circular believe that they're actually very closely linked. This idea of sort of crossing a veil. Just at different points in the life course. So in terms of, yes, to your point, death doulas are rapidly evolving in the American landscape, and the scholarship around them is also growing as well, which I find to be especially exciting. We're finally able to compete with the scholarship on death doulas that has been coming out from Australia over the past decade. So doulas are really non-medical companions in the end-of-life experience. Historically, they have been women, if you go far enough back in the texts, but contemporary doulas are, of course, span the spectrum of genders. And so really they are there to provide emotional support, psychological support, and logistical support in the experience of end of life, because there are so many moving pieces, and a lot of people, we are so lucky to have hospice available to us. But even what hospice can provide as compared to what the needs are, particularly in an end-of-life situation that's taking place at the home, there's a huge disparity there. And so to be able to have an outside source come in who is trained to walk people through the process, to share expectations and reduce uncertainties, can be incredibly valuable.
That additional support. So people hear the word doula, just know that there is both ends of the spectrum, or depending what your beliefs are, that circle of life, right? To be able to now this emerging profession of death doulas or end of life doulas. I mean, the societies, associations, trainings. I mean, I did my end of life doula training with the NALDA. And did you as well?
I did as well, yes.
So INALDA, for those that don't know, that's the International Association of End-of-Life Doulas. They're based I will put the information in the link with this podcast, but there are several end-of-life and death doula associations available. But do you see them starting? I see the death doulas starting to use some of the technology when it comes to more of that memorializing legacy moving forward, helping people to organize their digital assets in order to build out that memorialized component that the family is going to be sharing. Where else do you see that intersection between end of life and the digital support?
I interestingly saw a use case. I was chatting with an individual a few weeks ago who works in funerary services, and they are working. They have a technology that focuses in pre-planning, and so what they're able to do is through the pre-planning process, which is through a very user-friendly interface, all digital. They're actually able to generate what comes down to is a love letter for their dependents, to help explain why they made the choices that they made, in terms of disposition arrangements, in terms of choosing a green burial or not, for example, of choosing a celebration of life over a traditional funeral. And I think that's a really interesting application of, instead of just handing over, here's the contract that we signed to survivors, or that the decedent signed with the funeral home, here's a really empathetic, person-centered letter that explains the rationale behind the decisions that they made, so that you can feel more comfortable as a survivor with how you respond to those decisions. And so that to me was a really interesting use case, to go through that and to say, these are the values that I would most want to impart on you. If this was the last thing I was to ever say, really makes you reflect on, how am I living? Am I living in those values on a day-to-day basis? And so I really appreciate the technology that Sue has been developing, and providing parents, particularly young parents who may be leaving behind young children, providing them an opportunity to stay engaged with them as they age.
Well, Sue and I talked about, for myself, having lost my father, I was 11 years old. And so all I have are these, what I think are memories, but, they get clouded. And as the years go by, they get dimmed. And to have been able to have some sort of true handheld digital response of, hearing my father's voice, or him sending me a video of what his wishes were for me as an adult, would have saved me a lot of time and money and therapy, for sure. But, but this, I believe, is where we're kind of moving forward to. So we can talk about the wonderful aspects of having the digitized, memorialized options available, but let's go to the dark side. I'd like to step there too. So bioethics regarding AI, privacy protection, where do you see some of the problems post-mortem? So let's, for example, data privacy laws.
Mm-hmm.
For those that aren't familiar with GDPR, which is the European General Data Protection Regulations, and in the United States, we certainly have, each state has their own flavor of data privacy laws. Today is, November 2024. What life is going to look like next year or the years after, I don't know. But regarding postmortem, there's not a lot of language in these regulations about what happens to my data. Yes, when I'm alive, but who controls my data? And there's a lot of it out there when I'm gone. So what are your concerns?
Yeah, this is a really big area, and I'm hopeful that we're going to see more conversation on this in the next 2 or 3 years. I think the most relatable example that most people have been through, unfortunately, is recommendations of people to follow, whether that's on Instagram or Facebook, and that person is someone who has passed. So in my own experience, I can tell you that my grandmother, one of the grandchildren must have convinced her at one point to get an Instagram account. She never used it. She never posted. But I am still regularly suggested her account as someone that I should be friends with. And I think that that's a really interesting area. Another one that I've had a lot of people share with me, that's highly relatable, is just the pop-up of memories from someone who has died, who is no longer has an active Facebook account, for example. But you're receiving that annual reminder of this happened with that friend, and that photo's coming up, and maybe that's not something that you want. Maybe that's a reminder that is unwanted and is raw. And so I think one of the things that I would really like to see more technology companies not only have, but also make very accessible, is the ability to scrub data from their system through a postmortem request, right? So if that person has died, we have a death certificate, we have proof of death, an executor should be able to quite easily go in and remove that account, and remove that person's data if that's what they wished. And so that's something that I think I would like to see more tech ethicists come out more strongly on, and provide guidance on. As we're seeing, there's such a focus right now in terms of artificial intelligence, and wrapping our arms around that from a regulatory perspective and an ethical perspective. I hope to see this as part of that movement as well. I mentioned grief bots earlier, and so this is an opportunity that people have to take.
So I'm going sorry, and I'm going to jump in.
No,
Grief bots. Let's just do a definition on it for some people. They're not picking up on the term. So grief bot.
yes.
That is a what?
So there is actually an incredible academic definition that has just recently been developed, but sort of the layman's approach to defining it would be using a chatbot to recreate the communication patterns that an individual has to continue engaging with them post-mortem.
That feels like a Black Mirror episode that I saw.
There may have been one, actually.
No, it's for real. I mean, everything you just said is, and because I'm working on a project right now where we're trying to create an AI agent that has the tone and tonation of of a human that shows empathy during a very stressful time.
Mm.
So, are you saying that the technology now is, if my husband passed, that I could create a Chuck bot that I could just like Alexa, or Siri, hey Chuck, how are you feeling today? And that, are you saying that grief bot would just have an ongoing conversation with me all day long?
Yeah. So not only am I saying that it's possible, but I'm saying that it's already been done. And in fact, there's an incredible piece that I believe was published in Wired about a year ago. And the journalist went through this process after losing her mother and really talks transparently about what it was like to interact with that chatbot who, was her mother, or to believe to be, from a perceptual experience, believed to be some incarnation of her mother, and how quickly the cracks in the technology showed through, and how that, in many ways devolved her experience, her relationship with her mom post-mortem as part of that grieving process. And so I think that that's something we really need to have conversations about, because the technologies are out there, and naturally it depends on how much information you're going to feed that chatbot. Are you giving it carte blanche access to my iPhone, and every email I've ever sent and every text message I've ever sent? Because naturally, then the predictive patterns are going to be much more akin to how I would genuinely behave, as opposed to if you just give it, a sampling of one conversation with one person. But either way, what's most important to remember is it's not that person. It is not the same thing. It is a series of patterns that have been identified linguistically. It is not that person. We are not at that stage of the game. And so I find it really concerning that people are using the technology. Consumers, not necessarily scholars, consumers are already using the technology in that application. And we do not have an understanding of how that changes the grieving process, let alone the implications from a data privacy perspective.
On so many levels. And my head is spinning, because one thought that's popping in is, especially in the death and dying, the digital age space, is like, okay, where does suicide fit into this conversation, right? So trying to keep mental health, right? So it's a real balance in weaving in the technology as a benevolent tool,
Mm-hmm.
and not empowering people, but allowing them to move through a mourning process, but at the same time, not encouraging or promoting that, hey, it might be better on the other side because you can live forever with this chat bot. And
Yes.
not, so I don't know if you've done any studies or have any
That is not an
incredible.
area that I have dug into. I know certainly outside of the sphere of death care, there have been, unfortunately, more than one instance where AI and AI relationships with humans did lead to very unfortunate outcomes, with the individuals, feeling pressured to die by suicide. And so that's certainly something that I know. Unfortunately, we have what I suspect is a small sample of instances that have come up to the mainstream public of what may be a larger problem in reality. But that for me, that falls a little bit outside of the scope of sort of what I focus in. Those are more applications of user interfacing with AI from a general perspective, not necessarily related to end of life or the grieving process.
So if we stay on that end of life, we'll stay in our lane with the end of life and the bioethics as well.
Yes.
Can you share more about the influence on your personal views as far as how people can approach technology and end of life in building out their what you call, as a strategist?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to me, it really becomes about building awareness, not only for the fact that we're all going to die to begin with, because we still have a lot of work to do in just that realm, but also, bringing more awareness to the fact that we have such robust digital footprints, and how we want that to be taken care of at the end of life, right? Like that, it has to be an integral part of any type of advanced care planning, any type of trust planning at this point, to make sure that we're thinking through those different pieces. I had a doula maybe 2 or 3 years ago who had provided to me a list of, it was an Excel sheet of all the different potential logins that you might need to be able to pass on to a survivor. And it was pages of all of the different platforms that we use to piece together our lives, and so making sure some of those, of course, are more important for survivors to have access to than others. But that's just a small piece of it, being familiar with, for instance, the right to be forgotten and having your name removed from Google search is another thing that people might want to consider in terms of how they're going to manage their digital legacy. Because certainly that becomes a responsibility of the executor. So it's not only educating yourself, but making sure that the people that you are then putting in charge of these different aspects of your postmortem care understand what that means, so that when they say yes to being an executor, they're actually able to execute on that without it being such a heavy burden, because they're already going through the grieving process too.
Today I was talking with my team about fiduciary duties
Mm.
and how, and when you are assigned as an executor or a trustee, that it's you have to choose the right person who has the acumen, who has the mentality, who at now we're adding the technological savvy, right? There needs to be some sort of IT IQ, right? That they are
Mhm.
tech comfortable enough, they're not tech timid, that they can start digging in the passwords, finding out where the subscriptions are, having to deal with multiple pages, as you said, of online digital assets and be able to manage those. So those fiduciary duties are actually becoming more expansive when you've made an assignment. So you and I have actually spoken about, it's not common practice, although you and I believe it should be, to have a digital legacy advanced directive.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about that, and why we both believe that needs to be added to your estate planning documents.
Yeah. So I think this is originally sort of what brought us together, Niki, was conversations around, what does a personal identity advance directive or a personal data advance directive look like? And this is something that I feel very passionate about developing for the general public. Is some type of documentation. So we talk about advanced care directives, and those have become, really robust documents that say, this is the level of intervention I would want in these variety of healthcare situations. We really need to now mirror that in the digital sphere. These are the platforms I would like my data fully scrubbed from. These are the applications of my personal data that I am comfortable with post-mortem. Again, going back to that conversation of grief bots and chat bots, and all of the as yet unknown applications that might exist in just 3 years from now. When we talk about what our digital footprint is like. Do you want your social media to continue to exist? Do you want those platforms pulled down? Do you want, Facebook offers the memorialization transition. Is that something that you want enacted on your behalf? And so really, having a document that, again, guides survivors in terms of what you want done with your data, because your data profile is so much bigger than I don't I work with my students to help them understand how much data has been collected by just their social media platforms, and they are always astounded, and that's one or two platforms that they're using. And so when you really start to think about, going back to that Excel sheet that doula had shared with me, when you think about how many platforms you're using, just grab your phone and swipe up on all of the different apps that you have open on one given day. How do you want that data to live on or not? And what are the implications for those choices? And that's really what, in my vision, this data advanced directive would really look like. It would give people much more agency over their legacy from a digital perspective. And in many cases, the lives that we're leading, if you look at hours spent online versus offline, our digital legacy is going to be much more robust than our offline one.
Oh my goodness. The hours that are being calculated that we spend in front of a screen compared to even when we're talking to people, like we might be in a room engaging with people, but how many people are having a conversation and sharing their phone or texting while they're having a conversation? So it has just become the cyborg. I mean, to really say the idea that we really do need to understand that our phones are listening. So the fact that the phone is listening, it is gathering data, even knowing, because those apps are on, they are engaging, whether we're touching them or not, somehow they are designed to be on all the time, basically.
Many of them,
And
yes, yeah.
yes, many of them, right? So, and I think most people, especially let's say the younger generation. I'm a Gen X. You're
Millennial.
millennial,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if we go down to the Gen Zers versus an Alpha, right? They might be just completely immune to the fact that there's a level of lack of privacy.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Right. That's like asking, a 20-year-old to use a rotary phone.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that they're just not, it's not in their understanding. And I think that data privacy piece is also part of this cultural shift in the fourth industrial revolution that we are deep into right now.
Mm-hmm.
There is, whether you like it or not, if you're walking around with a smartphone, if you're listening to this podcast, then I would say that you are part of that ecosystem.
Yes.
So both you and I, as excited as we are about technology and the intersection between death and technology, we really do want to honor that it as a tool, but also to understand the complexity of it as we continue to move through, as you said, as an end-of-life futurist.
Yes, there are so many pieces, and I would just encourage anyone who's listening to this, if you were intrigued enough to hit play on this podcast, I hope that after listening, even if not for the entirety of the podcast, that you feel empowered to dig deeper, and to start to question some of these things. It can be surface level of, why as a culture do we tend to not talk about and engage death privately or in public forums. But then thinking about, some of these different technology solutions and how you might choose to engage with them differently, or how you might choose to plan more effectively when you're talking about things like trusts and wills and advanced care directives, for what you want your legacy to look like.
So to close us out on this conversation, as a futurist, 3 to 5 years, what do you think we should be planning for when it comes to our end of life planning?
Oh, that's a great question. Given that advanced care planning hits about just under 40%, I would say if we can make movement in just advanced care planning, I would be very, very excited. I would love to see a positive trend in that direction. At the same time, one thing that I encourage everyone to do, we know that even our baby boomers have a 90% adoption rate of smartphone technology. If you can take your phone and you can assign a legacy contact, that will have incredible implications for you when you're gone. It is a very easy process. It takes less than 2 minutes for that to happen. I strongly, strongly encourage everyone to do just that step alone.
Let me just say that is on the iPhone.
It is on the
Legacy
iPhone,
contact.
yes.
I have an Android. So everyone I meet, I do say, do you have an Android or iPhone? So what Sarah is saying is that and you have access to all this information with My Final Playbook app, and then also with Digital Legacy Podcast. We will share that information, but iPhone is offering today, everyone should look under your settings, privacy. You're going to go to your legacy contact. We will have an episode on what it means to build out your legacy contacts on your iPhone. But with that, and with Android, it's a little more complicated, more steps, but maybe in the future, these platforms, not just our phones, but all the social media platforms, will be able to make it more user-friendly for us to be able to control that, as you said, that memorialized postmortem option for us as well.
Absolutely. That is certainly the hope, and it's going to take a lot of voices in order for it to be done.
And with that, Sarah, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been an intriguing conversation. You and I will continue our conversation. As you know, we are the thought leaders in this death tech industry, and I know that there is room for more. So we invite people to connect with you. Best place for someone to find you?
Absolutely. On LinkedIn is going to be the best place, but through RPI as well, all of my contact information is accessible there.
And when she says RPI, that's Rensselaer Polytech Institute.
It is in upstate New York.
All good. All right. With that, thank you so much.
Thank you, Niki.
Thank you for listening to the Digital Legacy Podcast, where we talk about death and dying in the digital age. I hope this conversation inspired you to take control and plan for the inevitable to protect yourself and those you leave behind. Don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter at digitallegacypodcast.com. Remember, life is full of surprises. What happens after you die shouldn't be. So keep your passwords safe and your playbook up to date.